Welcome to Things That Are Harder. Today we're going to talk about focus tests, alpha and beta tests, as well as usability tests. Focus tests come in two broad categories: qualitative focus tests and quantitative focus tests. Qualitative focus test is probably what you are imagining when you hear the term focus test. You get 8 to 12 people in a room with a moderator, and they are shown things about a game or a product, and then they're asked a series of questions and they discuss what they've seen and what's going on. Usually in a qualitative focus test, there's also a mirror on one wall, and behind that mirror are a bunch of other people listening to the focus test. These days, you also usually get a live stream that you can watch from your office so that you can pay attention to what's going on in the focus test, even if you can't go. Qualitative focus tests, I think, can actually be really useful. They can be especially good for things where you're trying to measure emotional reaction to something. If you want to check to see if people are going to have a strong reaction to a follower, a qualitative test is actually really good for that, because you're getting an emotional reaction. And sometimes you actually don't necessarily care if it's a strong positive or negative reaction, as long as there's a reaction there. Qualitative tests can be really good for that kind of thing. And they can be good for projects where you have a limited amount of things to show, because you can tailor them around the conversation and around the stuff that you have. But you have to be careful with them, because there are some issues. Some of them are pretty obvious, some of them less so. First problem is that it's a very small sample size. So you can't take what a focus test is saying as gospel, because depending on exactly how the test group was put together, the results can be skewed somewhat one way or the other based upon exactly who happened to be selected for the focus test. Usually people in a qualitative focus test are paid something or given something for their time. So that also means that they're a little self-selecting, because not necessarily everyone is going to do it. You can't force someone to do a focus test. So they can be a little bit skewed from their results. The second issue is, because you have these 12 people in a room, the conversations can end up getting pulled off track by a single loud voice in the room. I've seen this happen with a lot of qualitative focus tests, where it seems like everything is going really well and everyone's on board, and then one guy says, I just don't like this person's hat. And then, because they say it with such confidence and they are able to draw the rest of the room into this conversation, now people who were happy with the hat or happy with what was being discussed now come around and say that they also don't like the hat. This is an example of the data being skewed, but one thing I would say is this can happen in the wild as well. If you have something that a small group of people can latch onto and don't like, and can yell loudly enough and convincingly enough, they can take control of your conversation. So while you shouldn't necessarily change the hat because one guy managed to derail the conversation at your qualitative focus test, you should think about why they were able to derail that conversation and things you can do to protect yourself when you are going out into the wild and talking to people in the real world, where there's no longer a moderator to drag the conversation back on topic. If this happens to you and you have an excellent moderator, it's definitely worth paying attention to the techniques that they use to drag that conversation back on topic, because they may be able to get information about why people change their minds, or give you talking points that will diffuse the conversation that you may not want to get into when your product is out. And that brings up my third concern or danger sign in a qualitative focus test is the moderator. A good moderator can get you an amazing amount of useful insights from a qualitative focus test. A bad moderator can act as a junior designer, biasing the conversation in the directions that they want to go, pushing to get answers that reflect what they feel your design should be, what they feel the answer should be. I've had both experiences with focus tests, both great moderators who are able to get a lot of very useful information out of very unresponsive test groups, as well as junior designer who is asking leading questions to drag the conversation in the direction that they want to go, to basically confirm their assertions. Something to be on the lookout with a qualitative test is confirmation bias. Because it's a interactive talking back and forth, chances are almost every opinion is going to be represented in the test at some moment in time. So it's very easy to latch on to that one comment that says the thing that you want to hear or the thing that you're afraid of, and allow that to derail the results of the test completely. Even worse is if you have an executive listening in on that focus test, because they are going to have their own biases and their own things that they're going to latch on to. So their confirmation bias and your confirmation bias are going to be different, and that is going to potentially result in very different reactions to the same test. Again, a good focus test company with a good moderator can help with this, because they can provide their own interpretation of what happened at the test. But if you've got a bad company and a bad moderator, that interpretation is going to be just as biased and just as skewed as your own. All of the different kinds of testing we're going to talk about today are vulnerable to biases, but the qualitative test is the most vulnerable. It's vulnerable to biases in the moderator, vulnerable to the biases in the people in the testing group, vulnerable to the biases of the people writing the report, vulnerable to the biases of the people listening to the tests. That doesn't make it useless. It just makes it the least anchored on data, the most open to emotion. And I think that's actually one of its greatest strengths as well. But you do need to be careful about relying on it for too much quantitative decision making. One of the, let's say, opportunities of the qualitative focus test is that it is running live. And because it doesn't have a very complicated setup usually, you're not running a live demo, you're not having people interacting with the code, it opens up an opportunity to actually change your stimulus and change your questions while the test is going on. You could run a test, realize that your stimulus is leading people down a rabbit hole, and actually change your stimulus for the next group. The reason why I call it a opportunity as opposed to just an opportunity is that it can be tempting to do this too much. And if you're constantly changing the input, then you can't really trust the output. So you should only really be changing what you're using in your test if it's actually a problem. Otherwise, let the test run through and deal with the results as they come. On the topic of the group you want in your focus group, a good focus testing organization will have good policies around mix. You will sometimes have to demand certain things. Sometimes it can be difficult to get a good representation from your female audience in the room. As well, you may want to run different tests focused on some of your smaller demographics, especially if you're trying to reach out to those demographics. If they're just two people in the room full of 12, they're going to get shouted down by the room. If you really want to hear what they have to say, then it's worthwhile to run a test just for them, get 12 of a specific audience in the room so that you can listen to what they have to say. If you're trying to move your turn-based RPG towards an action platformer, well, you want your core audience in one group so you can listen to how they react. You want platformers in another room so they can talk about their experiences with platforming and react to your prompt material. But it might be worthwhile to have a third test group with people who play platformers but also played your first game to get their reaction to the change. They are potentially your new core, but they could be hard to tease out of the data if they aren't isolated in some way. Second type of focus test is the quantitative focus test, sometimes called a quant test. This is something quite a bit different. This is usually done on the internet using an online survey where the whole point is to get yourself to statistical validity through a large sample set spread across a very large group. The number of questions you can ask in a quant test is relatively small because if it's too long, people are just going to nope out of the thing and you're not going to get good data. If you can attach your quant test to a platform that already knows a lot about its users. So if you have their gamer tag, or if you are doing it through Facebook or through another social media platform where the platform itself already knows a bunch about the person answering your questionnaire, this can be immensely helpful. Because obviously for a test like this, the more you know about the person, the more opportunities you have to carve up the data in a bunch of different ways. If you know what games they've played, it gives you an inkling into the kind of gamer that they are. So the more you can know, the better off you are. Again, limited by the number of questions you can ask in this specific survey, but potentially not limited in terms of what the platform you're asking on already knows. Quant tests have the advantage of having that statistical validity, but what you don't get from a quant test is the ability to see people reacting to stimulus, to hear the conversation. It's essentially a multiple choice, maybe with some comments, but basically you're getting multiple choice answers to your questions. As a result, you have to be very careful with your question form because it's very easy to form a question, what I like to call the would you like a chocolate bar question. If you ask a question in the wrong way, you're essentially just asking the person answering it whether or not they want a chocolate bar. And basically everyone's going to say, yes, I do want a chocolate bar. So that's not a useful question to ask. You have to be very careful in this kind of test to make people rank things or compare things against each other to force those comparisons to actually occur. Another thing to be very, very, very careful with quantitative testing is that they leak. Every single leak that BioWare ever had from a focus test came from a quant test. Now, partially that's just because the volume of people who could leak it is so much higher, but also it's way more anonymous. Looking someone in the eye and saying you're under NDA is a lot more effective than having them electronically click a button saying that they accept an NDA. So when you're doing a quant test, be careful that anything you put in there has a high probability of leaking, but that's potentially an opportunity. If you have information that you kind of want to be leaked out into the greater sphere of the internet, including it in a quant test, knowing that in all likelihood it's going to leak, might be a way to test the waters. It gives you plausible deniability if it does end up leaking. A good example of a leak like this was the concept picture of Dorian for Dragon Age Inquisition. The concept piece includes a monkey. We never really had any intention of having a monkey for Dorian, but it was just what was drawn in the concept piece. And so we got to watch the internet react to this character with a monkey on the internet. Before moving off of the more opinion-based tests, I think it's worth bringing up a quote from Henry Ford, which is, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And I do believe in focus tests, and I think it's worth seeing what people have to say about your stimulus material, but it is important to keep in mind that they don't know the things that you know. You're only able to show them a small snapshot. They don't have experience in the development areas that you have. This is data, not conclusions. Whatever you get back from a focus test needs to be sent through a lens to interpret it and draw conclusions after the fact, not in the moment that the focus test is going on. The third sort of related category of testing is the alpha and beta test. Now, in these tests, you have people playing your game. It might be restricted. You might have something that's a closed alpha or closed beta, or it might be wide open to everyone. I'm not going to go into definitions of alpha and beta because I feel like the terms have become so corrupted and mutated by marketing and by different software institutions and different game studios, so that at this point they largely have no consistently agreed upon meaning. Basically, these are a category of test where you have people playing a version of your game and you're gathering data off of those people. These can be incredibly powerful because this isn't people's opinions. You get to actually track their behavior. And there can often be a huge discrepancy between what people say they are going to do and what they actually do. So if you are able to do an alpha or beta test and gather true telemetry on actual player behavior, then that can give you immense insights. That being said, it is still not a true test because chances are your economy, if you have one, isn't running for real. There's not real money involved, so that's going to change player behavior. And people know that the character they're building isn't going to exist forever, so that's going to change player behavior. But it gives you insight that you can't get simply by sitting people down in a room and asking them what they believe. The problem that you can run into with alpha and beta tests is because they can come so late in the process, it can often be difficult to have enough time to react to the insights that you're actually getting back. Or if you try to run them early enough to have that runway, you may be having people interacting with a game that has several systems that are not fully baked, and the friction caused by those systems can skew the data that you're getting back from the alpha and beta test. So while they can be incredibly useful, it's difficult to have enough time to react to them. There are two dangers that can occur with larger alpha and beta tests. By larger, I mean getting into the tens of thousands of players. Because the number is so big, it's essentially like you've kind of launched the game. As a result, this can kind of suck the anticipation out of your game launch, because it's almost like that building tone of anticipation, which normally you would want to hit on your launch day, actually ends up hitting on this alpha or beta date. And then the energy goes out of your campaign. If your alpha or beta is actually in a pretty rough state, that can make it even worse, because now this news about problems with the game is getting out into the media cycle and competing with your marketing and undermining that marketing. Even though the point of the alpha and the beta is to test the game and make the game better, you don't have full control of your narrative anymore. And if you've put out something that isn't ready, which of course you are, because that's the point, it runs the risk of setting a narrative about your game that isn't what you want to be set. Additionally, with really large alpha and beta tests, you can actually essentially satisfy people's desire for the game, where people play your alpha, play your beta, are happy with it, but then are essentially done with the game and move on to something else because they've already played it. This is the weird paradox you also see with demos. With some games, this kind of early access play can actually hurt the game, because people come in, play the game, enjoy the experience, but then finish with that experience and move on. So while alphas and betas can be immensely useful, and sometimes you need to do them at scale in order to get the data that you need to act upon, the bigger they get, the more likely you could run into one of these risks around that scale working against you. So if you need to do a large scale test for a purely technical reason, it may be worth considering restricting what's in that test in order to control the narrative, control that satisfying of people's desire to play your game. game. A fourth kind of test that people may not be fully aware of is a usability test. This is not a focus test or an alpha test or a beta test. What this is designed to test the usability of your game or your software. In this case, you get a small group of people and they play your game or interact with a feature, usually in a controlled environment where there are cameras watching what they're doing and input recorders watching the buttons they press and the way they interact with the controller and where their eyes are even looking in some cases. This is a very focused kind of test. The purpose of a usability test is to really try to check for how easily your players can figure out how to interact with something. You can test things like the level of reward from a system as well in a usability test, but really this is about discoverability, understandability, friction, things like that. These, like a qualitative focus test, are relatively small tests, and they're usually moderated in some way. So, like a qualitative test, you do have to be on the lookout for your moderator being junior systems designer and pushing an agenda that may not be fully supported by the data. At the end of the day, all four of these kinds of tests are a tool. They're an input into your design process. They can't replace a systems designer or a level designer or the people that ultimately have built a career on understanding the craft of putting these things together. All they really should be used to do is to confirm or question some of the assumptions that you've made. If you believe that people are going to love your new pink-haired pony character, a qualitative test can help you understand what the reaction is going to actually be and maybe look for some red flags and some people who might have a hostile reaction to that. Doesn't mean you cut it, just means forewarned is forearmed and lets you prepare your presentation to mitigate or control those negative reactions. If you are trying to figure out how much content people want from a game of your style, a quantitative test might give you the ability to gather enough data to get a real answer to that, assuming you can frame that in a do you want a chocolate bar kind of way. If you're trying to figure out if people can understand your crafting system, a usability test is the perfect way to do that. If you're trying to figure out if your economy is balanced, or if your progression works, or even if there are some exploits in the way your combat system works, alpha and beta tests can be excellent ways to look for those things. They are a tool that you should use if you can, because whatever data you can get can help you do a better job and make a better game, but they shouldn't replace the judgment of yourself and your team when it comes to making decisions. And unfortunately, they can become used as a weapon against your team when the results of this kind of thing go to people further up in the corporate ladder. You may not be able to control that, and I don't really have any advice on how to control that, but the relationship you want with your testing organizations, your focus testing groups, your usability groups, the people that are helping you run your alpha and beta tests, is that they should be in service of the game team, not the larger organization. If they are starting to serve the larger organization, then you have no choice but to isolate these teams and feed them sanitized information in order to protect yourself and your team from the repercussions of a potentially bad test. So a warning on this one to anyone who runs one of these testing organizations. You might feel that you can serve two bosses, gathering data and providing support and help to game teams while also serving as an auditor for the greater organization, providing insight and input up to executives. But I'm here to tell you that you can't do that, that's impossible. It might work once, but as soon as you provide audit data to an executive executive, the team is going to start building a firewall around you. And that is going to make you incapable of doing your primary job, which is to do those tests properly. And then what happens? Then the executives start to wonder about your value. And when budget time comes around, they look at the department that's not providing value anymore, and that's where the cuts are going to come. You need the teams to trust you and be willing to give you their lumpy, warty builds, and you need to provide them value, even if that means you need to not provide the results of those tests upwards into the organization. Because in the long term, the group that's going to suffer is your group. Your group is going to be the one that feels the brunt of you being unable to actually execute your primary job, which is to gather insights on games for the game team. So why are focus tests, alpha tests, beta tests, usability tests more difficult than you think? Simply because there are different versions of them. They involve real people, which means that real opinions and biases can enter into the conversation, and because they can be used against you by the greater organization. I still recommend that you use them, but be aware, be careful. Hopefully this was useful. A special thanks to my members. They provide the support this channel needs to keep running. If you are interested in becoming a member of this channel, there's a link down below. If you found this video informative or interesting, give it a thumbs up so more people can see it. Share it with someone else you think might find some value out of it. I will see you again soon. Thank you.